April 1942, Assam, northeast India. The sun rises over tea plantations, painting the valley in shades of crimson and amber. A single Douglas C-47 sits on the runway at Chabua airfield, a squat, silver-bodied aircraft that looks more like a utility truck than a symbol of hope. The fuselage gleams in the early light. The pilots, Americans with weathered faces and hollow eyes, perform their pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. They do not yet know they are standing at the threshold of history. They do not yet understand that this worthless design, this cargo plane that nobody wanted, that generals dismissed, that seemed unsuitable for anything grander than hauling supplies, will become the beating heart of an empire's survival. They do not know that before this war ends, aircraft like this one will move 2 million tons of material across the deadliest sky in the world. What they know is this: the Japanese have locked away China. The Burma Road, the only land route carrying supplies and weapons to millions of Chinese soldiers and civilians, has been severed. Without it, the world's most populous nation will fall, and with it, the entire Pacific campaign will collapse. So American leaders have made a desperate decision. They will do the impossible. They will fly supplies over the Himalayas. The soldiers and civilians in China did not expect this mercy. In the spring of 1942, starvation was becoming a companion to every Chinese family. The Japanese armies had cut deep into the country, occupying the eastern provinces and starving the cities of the west. In Henan province, 500,000 people would die from hunger, disease, and despair as the spring rains failed, and locusts devoured what little remained. Women boiled leather and bark for sustenance. Children became hollow-eyed shadows. The nationalist government, unable to reach them by land, could only watch as its people withered. The American government then offered something almost unimaginable. We will feed you from the sky. We will send planes across mountains that have never been crossed before. We will build an invisible road of canvas and steel and aluminum that will defy the laws of physics, defy the Japanese, defy the monsoons and the ice storms and the sheer impossibility of the task. But who would design such an aircraft? Who would imagine a machine capable of this? The answer lay not in the visionary dreams of military planners, but in the pragmatism of a single engineer and the evolutionary accident of commercial aviation. Arthur Emmons Raymond was a different kind of hero. He did not command armies or give speeches on radio broadcasts. He was, in the autumn of 1932, a young aeronautical engineer at Douglas Aircraft Company, studying a problem that seemed almost trivial to the untrained eye. American Airlines wanted to compete with United Airlines on the transcontinental route. To do so, they needed a plane that could fly faster, carry more, and still maintain profitability. The DC-2 had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but it was not enough. Raymond and his team set out to create the next generation, the DC-3. The design was so elegant, so revolutionary, that it transformed commercial aviation overnight. For the first time, an airline could break even carrying only passengers. For the first time, the airplane became not a luxury for the wealthy, but a possibility for ordinary people. The beauty of Raymond's design was its simplicity. The plane did not strain to accomplish one spectacular feat. Instead, it did everything competently. It carried 21 passengers instead of 14. It flew faster and carried more fuel. Its engines were reliable Pratt and Whitney twin Wasps, workmanlike power plants that would not fail when you needed them most. The landing gear was sturdy. The fuselage was spacious. There was nothing revolutionary about any single element. What was revolutionary was how they all worked together. When the United States entered World War II, the military looked at the DC-3 and saw immediately what the airlines had discovered. This was the most useful airplane ever built. They modified it for military purposes, removed the seats, opened up the cargo hold, strengthened the fuselage, and called it the C-47 Skytrain. In Europe, it was known as the Dakota. In the minds of American planners in 1942, the C-47 was not meant to be exceptional. It was a workhorse, a truck with wings. Many generals and military planners thought the real victory in the air would come from bombers, from the B-17s and B-29s that would rain destruction on enemy cities from high altitude. Transport planes were necessary, yes, but they were unglamorous. They were the mundane machinery of logistics, not the romantic instruments of war. The C-47 carried 28 troops or 6,000 pounds of cargo. Its range was about 600 miles under normal conditions, but pilots could stretch that number under optimal circumstances. Its engines produced 200 horsepower each. It was not the fastest aircraft in the sky. It was not the most heavily armed. It was not the most complex. It simply worked. Arthur Raymond would never see the Himalayas. He would never experience the conditions that would test his design in ways he could never have anticipated. But the elegance of his thinking, the belief that utility matters more than spectacle, that reliability matters more than flash, would prove to be the very philosophy that made survival possible for millions of human beings. This is the strange alchemy of war. A commercial aircraft designed to make money for airlines becomes the instrument that keeps China in the fight. An engineer thinking about profit margins and passenger comfort inadvertently designs the blueprint for an operation that will rewrite the rules of aerial warfare and logistics. The pilots who flew over the hump did not know any of this historical context. They knew only that they were being asked to do something that many experienced aviators said was impossible. The Himalayas stretched across the border between India and China like a wall thrown up by nature itself. The peaks rose to 15,000 feet, 16,000 feet, and higher. Weather systems clashed over those mountains with tremendous violence. Monsoons would bring clouds so thick that pilots could not see the wingtips of their own aircraft. Ice storms at altitude could coat an airplane in inches of frozen water, adding tremendous weight and changing the aerodynamic properties in unpredictable ways. Turbulence would throw aircraft around like toys. Navigation was a nightmare. There were no radio beacons, no sophisticated navigation aids. Pilots had to fly by compass and dead reckoning, guessing where they were by how long they had been flying and how fast they were going. Over strange terrain, often in bad weather with no landmarks to guide them. Mistakes meant crashing into a mountain and becoming another unmarked grave in the wilderness. The Japanese had installed fighter squadrons at Myitkyina, threatening the lower routes. So the pilots had to climb higher, seeking routes over the peaks themselves where the thin air and ice made the flying even more treacherous. Japanese soldiers, stationed in occupied territories across Southeast Asia, received very different messages about what the war would bring them. Imperial propaganda spoke of glory. The emperor's voice was divine. Japanese soldiers were members of a master race, chosen to rule over an Asian co-prosperity sphere. Victory would come quickly, and it would be absolute. They would restore honor to Asia. They would crush the decadent Western powers. They would build an empire that would last for 1,000 years. What they actually experienced was starvation. By 1943 and 1944, Japanese soldiers across the Pacific had become hollow-eyed scarecrows. Resupply was sporadic and inadequate. Submarines could not carry enough. Destroyers running down the slot at night could only deliver so much. The diet of Japanese soldiers became increasingly desperate. Rice rations shrank. Protein vanished. Men began to die not from combat but from malnutrition. In the Philippines, in Burma, in the Central Pacific, Japanese garrisons began to consume their own stores of medical supplies, their equipment, whatever could be eaten. Some islands became cannibalistic. Officers issued orders about which body parts were permissible to consume. The warrior code that had promised honor and victory instead delivered starvation and death. The American soldiers and pilots, by contrast, had access to a level of material abundance that was almost incomprehensible. The Quartermaster Corps had developed special military rations, the C ration and the K ration, that, while monotonous, contained enough calories to sustain a soldier in the field. American bases had proper mess halls with hot food, canned meat, canned vegetables, powdered coffee, fresh bread when possible. American pilots flying out of Assam had access to actual meals prepared by cooks, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee. In the monsoon season, when the weather made flying nearly impossible, American ground crews had warm barracks, medical care, movies to watch in the evenings. The contrast was not subtle. It was a clash of civilizations. The Americans had designed an industrial system that could feed its soldiers even on the far side of the world. The Japanese had designed an empire that could not. This material abundance was itself a kind of weapon. American soldiers could think more clearly because they were not starving. They could maintain their equipment because they had time to rest. They could take risks because they knew that if they were injured, they would receive medical care. The German and Japanese soldiers, by contrast, were becoming hollow shells, driven by ideology and desperation rather than hope. The war was being won not in glorious aerial dogfights or desperate charges across beaches, but in the mundane calculus of calories per day, tons of supplies delivered, and industrial capacity applied to the problem of keeping human beings alive and functional. The pilots who flew the hump expected to be part of something glamorous. They expected to be fighter pilots engaging in aerial combat, shooting down enemy aircraft, writing their names in history. Some of them were former stunt pilots or commercial airline captains. They were men accustomed to respect and admiration. What they actually became was cargo jockeys. They flew regular schedules, hauling ammunition and rice and medical supplies, day after day, flight after flight. The monotony was broken only by crisis. When the engines failed over the mountains, when the weather turned to soup and visibility dropped to 30 feet, when the fuel gauges showed empty tanks and no airfield in sight, only then did the drama emerge. Many of them would be injured. Some would crash. Others would be forced to bail out over jungle, populated by headhunters and Japanese patrols. A few would die, but most would do the job. They would fly the hump, and in doing so they would become part of something far greater than individual heroism. They would become part of the machine that kept China in the war. The statistics tell a story of sacrifice and suffering. In July 1945, at the peak of the operation, pilots flying the hump delivered 71,042 tons of material in a single month. Over the course of the entire operation, from April 1942 to November 1945, American and Chinese pilots flying the hump delivered 650,000 tons of supplies to China. 650,000 tons, an amount so vast that it is difficult to comprehend. Imagine 2 million tons over the full duration of the expanded operations: ammunition, medicine, food, replacement aircraft parts, gasoline, textiles, everything needed to keep an army and a nation fighting. Everything delivered by aircraft that had to climb over mountains that reached toward the stars, that had to navigate through weather that would ground most aircraft, that had to fly routes where a single engine failure meant death. The cost was terrible. Approximately 600 American transport aircraft crashed in the Himalayas during the war. 600 planes. Each one represented a crew. 4 or 5 men who had trained together, who trusted each other, who died together when their aircraft failed them. At least 1,500 American airmen and passengers died in those crashes. Entire crews lost to engine failure at high altitude. Crews lost to weather, flying into mountains they could not see through the clouds. Crews lost to Japanese fighters that managed to intercept them. Crews lost to mechanical failure, to human error, to the simple fact that they were pushing themselves and their aircraft beyond the margins of safety. Doctors could die delivering medical supplies. Diplomats could die on urgent missions. Supply officers could die carrying ammunition. No one was exempt from the danger. The Himalayas were an equal opportunity killer. General Curtis LeMay would later run a tighter operation, demanding discipline and efficiency, reducing the accident rate. But in the early days, the operation was chaotic and dangerous. General Robert Hardin, who took command in 1943, was willing to accept losses as the cost of delivering tonnage. He flew at night when others grounded their aircraft. He ignored weather forecasts. He pushed pilots to fly beyond the limits of their experience and their aircraft's capability. During one 7-month period under his command, there were 135 major accidents and 168 crew fatalities. Hardin's philosophy was uncompromising. The tonnage delivered mattered more than the number of pilots who died to deliver it. This was not cruelty. It was a calculus. If China fell, millions would die. If pilots died, a few thousand at most would be lost. The mathematics were brutal, but they were consistent with the demands of total war. Later, when LeMay took over and instituted safety procedures and restricted flying to daylight hours under better weather conditions, the tonnage actually increased because fewer aircraft were being lost to accidents. Arthur Raymond, the engineer who designed the C-47, understood efficiency. He understood that a well-designed system could accomplish more than a hastily improvised operation. The C-47, with its proven design and reliable engines, was the workhorse that made the hump operation possible. Without it, the operation would not have been feasible. The aircraft had to be able to carry enough cargo to make the long, dangerous flight worth the risk. It had to be reliable enough to make multiple flights without constant major maintenance. It had to have enough range to complete the journey even with fuel burn to overcome unexpected headwinds. The C-47 did all of this. It was not perfect. It was not glamorous, but it was the most important aircraft ever designed by a single engineer for a single purpose. The Douglas C-47 could carry 6,000 pounds of cargo. In modern terms, this seems modest. But consider what could fit in that space. A Jeep weighed about 300 pounds. A C-47 could carry 4.5 Jeeps. Or imagine ammunition. A case of .30 caliber machine gun ammunition weighed about 50 pounds, so 120 cases could fit in a C-47's cargo hold. Imagine medical supplies, sulfanilamide drugs, morphine, plasma, bandages, surgical instruments, all compressed into 6,000 pounds. Imagine gasoline for fighter aircraft, essential for the Chinese Air Force to maintain operations. One C-47 load of fuel meant Chinese pilots could fly 2 more missions. 3 C-47 loads meant a dogfight in the skies over China. 10 C-47 loads meant a sustained offensive against Japanese positions. When pilots looked at the C-47, they often saw limitations. The cargo hold was cramped. The engines were not as powerful as those in bombers. The fuselage was not armored or heavily armed. What they did not see was the brilliance of the design. The C-47 had been designed by Raymond to carry 21 passengers in comfort. When converted to cargo use, those seats came out, and suddenly there was a spacious, efficient cargo hold. The engines, while modest in power, were extremely reliable. Pratt & Whitney had built tens of thousands of R-1830 twin Wasp engines for various military aircraft. Pilots knew these engines. Mechanics knew how to repair them. Spare parts were available. The C-47 could land on relatively short, unprepared airfields, an advantage when operating from bases in remote India and China. The range was adequate for the mission. With proper fuel management, it could fly from Assam to Kunming and back, even with a full load. The design was forgiving. It did not require pilots to be geniuses. Competent, careful flying would deliver results. This is the essence of what Arthur Raymond had learned when designing the DC-3. Elegance is not about complexity. It is about simplicity and clarity of purpose. Every element of the design served the mission. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was superfluous. The aircraft succeeded because it understood its role and fulfilled it perfectly. The military C-47 inherited all of these qualities. It was designed not to be the best at any one thing, but to be good enough at everything that mattered. The first pilots to fly the hump in April 1942 could barely believe what they were being asked to do. The route was 500 miles over the eastern Himalayas from Assam to Kunming, 500 miles of some of the most dangerous flying in the world. The mountains themselves rose to 15,000 and 16,000 feet. The C-47 service ceiling was officially 26,400 feet, but at maximum weight, the aircraft struggled to reach 20,000 feet. Pilots would have to fly along valleys and passes, threading their way through the mountains rather than flying directly over them. This meant longer flight times, burning more fuel, requiring better navigation. The weather was unpredictable. The monsoons came at certain times of year and made flying nearly impossible. Even during the supposedly good weather months, unexpected storms could appear within minutes. The Japanese were a threat on the lower routes, so pilots learned to climb to 10,000 feet or higher to avoid fighter interception. At those altitudes, oxygen became critical. Hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, could strike swiftly, causing confusion and poor decision-making. Crews had to stay alert to every symptom: dizziness, tingling in the fingers, a feeling of euphoria that masked the danger. And yet, despite all these obstacles, the pilots flew. They flew singly and in formations. They flew when weather was marginal. They flew through darkness and through blinding sunlight. They flew when their aircraft were damaged and barely airworthy. They flew because they understood on some level that they were keeping alive a nation of 400 million people. This knowledge did not prevent fear. It did not prevent accidents, but it gave meaning to the work. By the end of 1942, the hump operation had delivered almost no tonnage. The figure was so small it barely mattered statistically. The pilots were learning the routes, developing techniques, discovering what worked and what did not. The weather had been bad. The aircraft had crashed. The operation seemed like a failure. But in 1943, as more C-47s became available, as pilots gained experience, as ground crews developed better maintenance procedures, the tonnage began to increase. In July 1943, 2,500 tons were delivered. This was still far short of the ambitious target of 10,000 tons per month that the American military had promised to the Chinese government, but it was progress. By the summer of 1944, with additional aircraft arriving and operations streamlined, monthly tonnage climbed to 20,000, then 30,000, then finally to 7142 tons in July 1945. Consider what this number meant in human terms. 71,042 tons in a single month. That was enough to supply millions of Chinese soldiers and civilians with food, ammunition, and medical care. But more importantly, it was enough to prove a concept. The hump operation demonstrated that aircraft could be used to transport massive quantities of material over impossible terrain. This was not accidental. This was the systematic application of American industrial capacity to a logistical problem. American planners designed the operation, procured the aircraft, trained the pilots, established the bases, and managed every detail. American factories produced the C-47s. American workers built the engines. American engineers designed the bases in remote locations. It was a triumph of organization and will. Arthur Raymond had made all of this possible, though he probably never thought of it in those terms. He had simply designed an aircraft that was good enough to do the job. Good enough. In a sense, those words capture the entire secret of American success in World War II. America did not need to build the perfect aircraft. It needed to build aircraft that were good enough to do the job, and then to build them in overwhelming quantities. A German aircraft might be superior in one dimension, perhaps more agile or faster or more heavily armed. But an American aircraft that was good enough in all dimensions, produced in thousands of examples with excellent supply lines and replacement systems, would ultimately triumph. The quantity had a quality all its own. The symbolic object that came to represent this abundance was coffee. In American bases across the CBI theater, China, Burma, India, coffee was relatively abundant. Even on remote airfields, there would be a mess tent where pilots could get a cup of hot coffee. It was a small thing, but it carried enormous weight. Coffee represented not just calories, but care. It meant that the American military understood that its people, while performing dangerous duties, deserved basic comforts. A hot drink on a cold morning, a moment of rest before the next sortie. This was not the experience of most soldiers in the world's armies. British troops in Burma had tea, but often it was weak and made with limited supplies. Japanese soldiers had nothing. Indian soldiers serving with the British had limited rations. But American pilots and crew had coffee, and this simple fact spoke volumes about what was at stake in the war. America was fighting not just for military victory, but for a system in which people were valued, fed, cared for. The war was about democracy and freedom, yes, but on a practical level, it was about the ability of industrial civilization to deliver goods and services to people far from home. America could do that. The Axis could not. By 1944, the hump operation had become so efficient that a well-trained pilot could complete a round trip in a single day, fly from Assam to Kunming, drop off cargo, fuel up, and fly back. Roughly 1,000 miles of flying over the Himalayas in a single day. The C-47 made this possible. Its reliability meant that mechanical failure was rare. Its cargo capacity meant that each flight mattered. Its range meant that the distance, while long, was not impossibly long. The pilots developed techniques for managing the thin air and the ice. They learned which valleys offered shelter from the worst weather. They memorized landmarks. They developed radio procedures for communicating across the mountains. They learned to recognize the signs of engine trouble and to manage an aircraft with a failing engine. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the operation that had seemed suicidal became routine. Not safe. Never safe, but routine. A man can do routine tasks even when they carry danger. What would break a pilot was the constant surprise, the constant terror of the unknown. But as the hump operation matured, it became known. Known quantity, known risks, known procedures. Pilots still died. Aircraft still crashed. But the operation itself became institutionalized, professionalized, optimized. This was what American planning and American industrial capability could achieve. This was what Arthur Raymond's elegant design made possible. This was what 2 million tons of material meant in practical terms. It meant survival, not just for Chinese soldiers, but for the entire project of preserving a democratic China. For every pilot who died, millions of civilians lived. When we speak of sacrifice, We often think of individual acts of heroism. A soldier running into machine gun fire to save comrades. A pilot remaining at the controls of a damaged aircraft to ensure his crew could bail out. A medic moving through a battlefield treating the wounded. These things happened on the hump. But the deeper sacrifice was simpler and more profound. It was the sacrifice of flying a dangerous route day after day. It was the sacrifice of accepting danger as the price of keeping an entire nation alive. It was the sacrifice of pilots who knew that statistically, some of them would not survive, but who flew anyway because the alternative was allowing millions of Chinese people to die from starvation. This kind of sacrifice requires no dramatic moment. It requires only the discipline to continue. The transformation that occurred was not in the pilots themselves. Men do not become different people by flying dangerous routes. Rather, it was in their understanding of what their work meant. When pilots began flying the hump, many of them saw themselves as victims of military bureaucracy, assigned to an impossible task in a remote location. By the time the operation ended in November 1945, those same pilots understood that they had been part of something historic. They had kept China alive. They had demonstrated that aircraft could move mass quantities of material across any terrain. They had shown that human courage, combined with reliable machinery and good planning, could accomplish the seemingly impossible. The Hump Pilots Association would meet for decades after the war, and the members would speak with pride about their role in the Pacific victory. Not the fighter pilots, not the bombardiers, not the infantrymen, but the transport pilots. Ordinary men flying ordinary aircraft, doing ordinary work, achieving extraordinary results. This is the deeper truth about World War II. The victory did not come from individual acts of heroism, though these certainly occurred. It came from the systematic application of industrial capacity, scientific thinking, and organizational skill to the problem of defeating military regimes that had rejected both science and human rights. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were civilizations built on ideology and will, demanding sacrifice and loyalty from their people, but unable to feed their soldiers or maintain their equipment. The United States, by contrast, was a civilization built on pragmatism and abundance, on the principle that materials matter, that logistics matter, that an engineer like Arthur Raymond sitting at a drafting table matters. Every well-designed aircraft, every can of sea rations, every gallon of fuel delivered over the hump mattered. The accumulation of these practical advantages, multiplied across millions of decisions and actions, produced victory. The C-47 Skytrain flew on after the war. Civilian versions, still called DC-3s, returned to commercial service. Airlines flew them for decades. Military variants served in conflicts around the world. The aircraft that had been dismissed as worthless and utilitarian became one of the most celebrated and most copied aircraft designs in history. Military aircraft designers worldwide studied the C-47 and sought to replicate its qualities. American cargo planes that followed, the C-119, the C-130 Hercules, were spiritual descendants of the C-47, built on the same principles of reliable simplicity and cargo capacity. Arthur Raymond lived to see much of this legacy. He retired from Douglas Aircraft in 1960 and then moved into government service, helping to manage aerospace development. He saw the age of jet aircraft arrive. He saw space exploration begin. He helped found the RAND Corporation, the research organization that would guide American strategic thinking for decades. In 1991, when he was 92 years old, he received the National Air and Space Museum Lifetime Achievement Trophy. He lived to age 99, and when he died in 1999, he left behind not just the C-47, but an entire philosophy of design, the principle that utility and reliability matter more than complexity and spectacle. The pilots who flew the hump in 1942, expecting glamour and finding monotony, gradually understood a profound truth about war and about human nature. Glory comes not from individual heroics, but from sustained, competent work. Victory comes not from the spectacular moment of combat, but from the 1,000 small decisions and actions that prevent disaster and maintain order. A well-designed aircraft, flown by competent pilots with good maintenance and good planning, will accomplish more than a brilliant aircraft pushed beyond its limits by desperate men. The C-47 embodied this philosophy. It was good enough to fly the hump, good enough to move 2 million tons, good enough to keep alive an entire nation. In the end, the real legacy of the hump operation was not statistical. It was philosophical. The Allies had proven that they could do the impossible through the application of science, engineering, and industrial capacity. Japan and Germany had relied on will and ideology. In the final analysis, logistics defeated ideology. Organization defeated fervor. The carefully designed aircraft designed by men like Arthur Raymond, flown by ordinary pilots carrying supplies through dangerous skies, proved that in the modern world, the triumph belongs not to the most fanatical, but to the most competent. This was the true victory of World War II. It was not a comfortable victory. It did not establish a perfect world, but it preserved the possibility of human freedom and democratic governance at a moment when those possibilities seemed to be flickering out. Today, 80 years later, we can look back at the hump operation and see it as a watershed moment, not just in military history, not just in aviation history, but in human history, because it demonstrated something essential about what free societies can accomplish when they apply their resources with intelligence and determination. American pilots flying aircraft designed by American engineers, maintained by American mechanics, supplied by American industry, kept alive millions of Chinese people. This was not inevitable. It was not guaranteed. It happened because one engineer, Arthur Raymond, designed an aircraft that was reliable and efficient. Because military leaders, despite their misgivings, decided to attempt the impossible. Because pilots, despite their fears, flew day after day. Because ground crews, despite the heat and the monsoons, maintained equipment and built bases in remote locations. The symbolic coffee cup that appeared in every American base represented something larger than mere comfort. It represented a statement about what America valued. We value our people. We provide for them. We do not drive them to starvation in pursuit of ideological purity. We do not demand absolute sacrifice without offering adequate sustenance. This philosophy, applied across millions of decisions and small actions, proved to be more powerful than the fanaticism of our enemies. The C-47, that humble cargo aircraft, became the physical manifestation of this philosophy. It was good enough. Good enough to accomplish what others thought impossible. Good enough to move the weight of an entire nation's survival across mountains that touched the sky. And in being good enough, it became great. When we remember the hump operation today, we tend to focus on the statistics. 600 aircraft lost, 2,500 deaths, 50,000 tons delivered. But the true meaning lies deeper. It lies in the understanding that human civilization, at its best, applies intelligence and care to the problem of keeping people alive. That design matters. That engineering matters. That the carefully considered work of one man, Arthur Raymond, drawing lines on paper, specifying dimensions, calculating aerodynamics, can change the course of history. The C-47 did not change history through speed or armament or maneuverability. It changed history through reliability and utility, through the profound gift of getting the job done. In the end, the hump operation tells us something essential about freedom and democracy. It tells us that free societies, built on the principle that people matter and deserve care, will ultimately triumph over societies built on the principle that people are merely instruments of state power. The American pilots who flew the hump were not the most dedicated or the most willing to sacrifice. Many of them complained. Many of them were afraid. Many of them resented the danger and the monotony. But they continued flying because they understood on some level that their work mattered. It mattered for China. It mattered for democracy. It mattered for the future of human freedom. And in understanding this, they became part of something larger than themselves. They became the embodiment of hope. They became the physical manifestation of the belief that human beings, working together with intelligence and determination, can accomplish what seems impossible. This was the true achievement of the hump operation. Not the tonnage delivered or the record set, but the proof that freedom, when organized and applied with discipline, is more powerful than ideology and will. The C-47, that humble aircraft that nobody wanted at first, became the vehicle of this truth, carrying not just cargo, but the future of human civilization itself, across mountains that reach toward the heavens.